Howdy, Immortalium here, and today I want to have a discussion about something that I kind of wanted to discuss for a while, but I always thought it was kind of a bit of an odd video to make because this video is actually going to require me to discuss a lot of Western animation, or a lot about Western animation at the very least. But it is true that anime, very distinct from Western animation or many other types of animation, but it is fundamentally animation. And it didn't develop in a vacuum. It was impacted by all sorts of animation, as we might end up discussing in a little bit. But the basic point that I wanted to discuss was the impact of the dark age of animation on anime, which I think is a very fascinating topic. So I guess the first thing that I have to explain, of course, is, what is the dark age of animation? Basically, prior to, I think it's fair to say 1960, animation was actually very popular. Disney movies were doing really well in the box office, and cartoon shorts were doing really well. I'm talking like Looney Tunes, I'm talking like Betty Boop and Popeye and Tom and Jerry and all of those ones. And it wasn't a case that people thought that they were for children. What a lot of people seem to forget is that prior to this dark age of animation, animation was viewed as a medium that everyone can enjoy. It wasn't relegated to the young ones. But there was a couple of things that led to the kind of downfall of animation, at least for several decades. For one, it was the rise of television. Basically, as television became more and more popular, understandably, film studios were concerned about, will people still go to the cinema and watch our movies? They can just sit home and watch the television instead. How are we going to get people to come in? And they came up with all sorts of ideas, and the ideas that they came up with are quite fascinating. But I'm going to focus specifically on the animation side of it. And very famously, Disney produced Sleeping Beauty. Now, I'm sure a lot of people, when they think of Sleeping Beauty, they think of it as one of the Disney classics, oh, such a successful movie, blah, 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 blah. In reality, when Sleeping Beauty was first released, it was actually quite a failure. That was because it was very expensive to produce. It was filmed in a more cinematic aspect ratio, and the amount of techniques, the amount of detail and stylizations that they incorporated into the film caused this budget to become very large. And unfortunately, as a fan of Disney's Sleeping Beauty, it was a failure. It didn't do well at all in the box office. It caused Disney to lose a lot of money at the time. And after that, that's when animation began to change. So of course there was also the rise of limited animation for television. People wanted animation for television, but had to be much cheaper. And that's where we saw Hanna-Barbera come in, creating shows, like the Flintstones, Yogi Bear, all of those ones. And they incorporated so much limited animation in the way that characters' body parts were separately animated, backgrounds were less detailed and more abstract, they used a lower frame rate, etc, etc. That was a considerable drop in animation quality. And it turned out that the people that were most receptive to this drop in animation quality were children, which is why so much television animation became targeted towards the kids. At the same time, Disney incorporated a lot more cost-cutting into their films, and you'll notice that films that they released afterwards have this very scratchy, rougher look to them due to a combination of lower budgets and a new technique. I think they call it zorography or something. I can't remember exactly. But movies like 101 Dalmatians, Robin Hood, Aristocats, etc, etc, they all had this much less clean, scratchier look than the prior Disney animated movies. So having discussed all of that now, let's actually move on to the impact that it had on anime. So animation had been a thing in Japan for quite some time. There'd been plenty of older animated shorts that they produced. They did produce a couple of feature films, most famously Momotaro's Sacred Sailors and Panda and the Magic Serpent. But I do think that as foundational and as important as those movies are on a medium of anime, I do think that one of the most important releases at the time was Astro Boy. Now, Astro Boy was produced by Osamu Tezuka, obviously based on his manga of the same name, and they released it, I believe it was the 1st of January 1963. And of course, Astro Boy was a big, massive success, and it laid the foundation for many other TV animation. Even many of its techniques ended up being used in feature films. But it is important to note what happened with it. So basically, the way that animation kind of worked at the time, TV animation at the very least, was that a lot of these American animated series would run in America. They'd make all of their money back and a nice little profit while they were running in America, and then they'd be sold cheaply to television networks the worldwide. And one side effect of the fact that these shows were sold so cheaply was that it really damaged the ability of a lot of countries to be able to produce their own animation, because they needed to compete with these really cheaply licensed shows. And that's something that Osamu Tezuka also ran into. Because of that, this necessitated that he incorporate a lot of techniques into Astro Boy as cost-cutting measures. For instance, he would frequently reuse backgrounds and animation in order to prevent having to redo them again. He would have characters express themselves differently. For instance, if they were nervous, they'd have like a drop come down their forehead in order to reduce the amount of animation needed. And very famously, he reduced the frame rate. I believe he went down to about 8 frames per second. And even then, he was still losing money when he sold it to the TV networks. In order to actually make a profit, he had to rely on merchandising and licensing Astro Boy to other TV networks worldwide. Now, ultimately, that did prove to be successful, but it also introduced a bit of a negative precedent when it came to anime. For one, the idea that anime be sold cheaply to TV networks has been taken to the extreme in the modern day. With many late-night anime series, they pay the network to air them. They're essentially commercials, which is so bizarre to think about, but that's how it works. And even today, a lot of those cost-cutting measures are still in place. Now, the dark age of animation did eventually end, and of course it was a very America-centric thing. Of course, anime was actually doing pretty well overall during the 60s and 70s and 80s. Even if they had to keep costs low and incorporate all sorts of limited animation techniques, etc., etc. When it comes to when the dark age of animation ended, there is some debate on it. I've seen people argue that it ended in the early 80s, and then other people say that it ended in the early 90s, which is quite a bit of a gap. But it was basically between those points, and that's when animation started to be taken more seriously again. They became more financially successful, etc., etc. So even if the dark age of animation predominantly was affecting American animation, it did very much end up having an impact on anime itself. And I just find that concept quite fascinating, because again, it's something that a lot of people don't really talk about. Of course, I don't see too many people talking about the limited animation techniques used in anime in the first place, but a lot of those were necessitated because of the American dark age of animation. So I just wanted to kind of share my thoughts on that, explain it. So that was my discussion of the dark age of animation and how it impacted anime. Of course, I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts on all this. Were you aware of the dark age of animation before, or how it impacted anime? What are your thoughts on all of these techniques that were introduced in order to keep costs down and to be able to compete more effectively against American animation at the time? Of course, if you have any additional information about animation, about anime, about Osamu Tezuka or Astro Boy, etc., etc., please leave them in the comments below. And of course, if you want to support the channel, I would encourage you to use my Amazon and Right Stuff affiliate links in the description below. When you purchase an anime or manga through those affiliate links, not only supporting me, not only supporting the channel, but you're also supporting the anime and manga industry. So I highly encourage you to purchase the anime and manga through those affiliate links. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment, rate, subscribe, and bye bye.